Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Daphne Zohar, the founder and CEO of PureTech Health.
Good morning, everyone. It is 9 o'clock or 7 o'clock my time. I'm Mountain Time Zone today. So we're so glad that you're joining us for our New York Bio virtual breakfast series. We've been doing these for a while now, and we've had some very interesting conversations with thought leaders really now across the US. Virtual means we're no longer tied just to people that can be in a conference room or a restaurant for a breakfast in Manhattan. So now we have been able to expand our horizons and have guests like Daphne and others who are really making a difference in our ecosystem across the US, which is fantastic. New York is in a very interesting position now. We finally have the last section of the state that's entered phase 1 of reopening. New York City is now in phase 1, which means, as you all know, construction, retail pickup, those sorts of things are able to open. The rest of the state is entering phase 2. So obviously companies those of you that have had your lab operations continuing to run on the essential designation, but have had your office staff home, are now working on plans to get that back. We're going to be putting out some more information and working with some of the HR professionals across the industry to try and help guide you on best practices, help be able to respond to some questions as they come up. Everyone is doing their best, and it was interesting because over the last 4 days, I actually drove across the country and to see the different, I guess we had 13 states we hit, and to see the differences in different regions. Clearly, I think New Yorkers are still doing a very good job, wearing masks, being, respectful of the distance you're being from other people. It is definitely not that way in other parts of the country. So it was a little bit of a shell shock, but I think we'll continue to see that. And as you open your offices, we'll see it even more. It'll be even more distinctive. And as you make plans to have your folks back on full time in the office. Coming up, we obviously look forward to continuing to host this series. We're also preparing to host a series of conversations with our emerging biotech companies. And we look forward to hosting them and getting ready to lead up to our emerging biotech company showcase at the New York Stock Exchange. Finally, the New York Bio annual meeting was postponed from March 10th to September 14th. And we will have a virtual component. We're not exactly sure yet if it will be entirely virtual, but we are making plans to still be able to host and engage with you on September 14th. With that, I will, one more thing. At the bottom of your screen on your Zoom platform, you have a Q&A and a chat. You can use either of those to ask questions of Daphne or Derek and me during the conversation today. We look forward to the conversation, and I'm going to flip it over to Derek to introduce Daphne. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Daphne. Really, really glad you could join us today. We tend to have people on here that are, at the forefront of innovation in biotech, and it's one of the reasons that we were super excited to have you on. So coming to us from outside Boston, Massachusetts, Daphne is I would say probably one of the premier company builders in the entire biotech industry. She's been the founder and CEO of PureTech Health since its inception. The company has over 20 product candidates to their name. They have 13 clinical stage compounds in development. And they're also the driving force behind some of the names that you may have heard of. The company Karuna, which IPO'd last year with a drug for acute psychosis. The company Gelesis in weight management, which has an approved partnership, and Akili Therapeutics, which is one of the leaders in digital therapeutics as well. So super excited to talk to you this morning, Daphne. If you could give everybody kind of a little bit of background on where you came from, how PureTech got to be where it is, we can get going.
Great, thanks so much for having me. This is a great format here. So PureTech is a biotherapeutics company, and we have an interesting sort of evolution to the model, and I think some things that we've learned that could be useful to people in general. So we started PureTech really, I was interested in some of the inefficiencies around starting biotech companies, being an entrepreneur myself. And one of the things that sort of struck me is that a lot of biotech companies get started by entrepreneurs or scientists that have one specific idea. And what ends up happening is the entrepreneurs or scientists that are able to raise funding then move those forward. And it's interesting because VCs say that they bet on the jockey, not the horse, right? So the question is, who's really selecting the best horses or the best technologies? So the idea behind PureTech was really to sort of start from the other direction, to take a look at disease area, work with some of the leading scientists, and really look at what would be the best ideas. So kind of with a blank slate, say, what's been the issue with this disease? What have been different approaches that have been taken to tackle this disease? What are the problems that those approaches have run into? As you think about those problems, what are new angles you could take that could be modality agnostic? And also to say, really, what's going on in the leading labs, what's the leading science, and to start that, completely blank slate, but with the leading experts around the table. And what we found when we initially did this was we thought that, some of the scientists that would be promoting their own work or coming with a specific angle. And it was really interesting because a lot of those scientists are on advisory boards for major companies, for startups, but they very rarely get asked, what would you do if you could do anything? And that's actually the evolution story of a lot of the new medicines that we've developed at PureTech. I think the other thing that people don't know about PureTech or don't realize is that we were the innovator, the initiator, the co-inventor of all of the programs. As you mentioned, we have 23 product candidates that came out of our efforts. We have, of those, 14 are clinical stage. One's been approved by FDA or cleared by FDA now, approved in the EU for marketing. This team at PureTech was actually inventors on those products. I think people think of us as some sort of an investment vehicle, but we really see ourselves as, kind of an institutional entrepreneur, a drug development or therapeutics development company. I'm gonna unpin my own video.
Yeah, it's a little easy to kind of put, sorry.
Go ahead, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little easy to try and put certain, yeah, we can hear you. It's a little easy to try and put the players within the biotech ecosystem into a particular box, right? Say you have the investors, you have the entrepreneurs, you have the large companies, you have academia, and it's interesting you bring up that approach, because if you have the traditional approach, if you look at just taking either IP out of a university, the people associated with that IP have a vested interest in making their original idea the thing that gets funded or the thing that gets taken forward, right? All of the incentive for anyone owning the IP is for that IP to end up being the thing that's valuable, not necessarily, well, this is really good science, let's see where this goes, let's see what we can build around it, right? So it's a change from what many would consider the initial model that way. So if we start, so how does the way that you operate change the way you think about team building? And for the audience, PureTech has been able to build an exceptional team of advisors, board members, et cetera, and you have these kind of very public, amazing leading scientists around you, and you also have to build the team behind it to basically make the machinery that basically gets the assets and the science where it needs to go.
Yeah, so I think I just addressed the first part of what you said first, and I'd love to talk about team building. So one of the things that I think is interesting about the IP and this concept of people coming with a specific idea is there tends to be a hesitation around being willing to kill that idea. And actually, I think a key part of the model that we've set up is that we try to do the experiments that could kill the project early on. And that's a little bit counterintuitive because I think as an entrepreneur, you kind of want to move it forward. And sometimes that takes a little bit longer because you say, we're going to do this experiment. It's the experiment that everybody's most skeptical about. It's a thing that everybody thinks is not going to work, but then if it works, it drives a lot of value. I think that's an interesting piece of this that we could come back to. In terms of teams, it's really interesting as an entrepreneur. I think of being like an entrepreneur, like a true entrepreneur, not coming from, a VC firm or just, just somebody who's trying to start a company. It's almost like entering the void, right? Because, you want to build something and you need people, you need money, and you need technology in order to build something. And none of those elements exist if you're starting something from scratch. So how do you overcome that sort of inertia of not having people, money, or technology? People are attracted to money and technology, and all of these elements kind of are attracted to each other and repelled by the absence of the others. So one of the things that I think has been very helpful to us is, as you pointed out, starting with the people. And I think the people are drawn, in our case, and I think, I'm very proud of the team that we have both internally and the people that we have around it, to the work that we're doing, which is really sort of seeking out the truth. Where is the science taking us? What is the approach that could actually have an impact in this disease, and doing that in an entirely unbiased way. So I think for some of these leading scientists in specific disciplines or disease areas, for them, it's having a real impact, not just being an advisor on an advisory board, but knowing that you say something and people are going to follow up. They're going to come back to you, and your idea might actually get advanced, even if it's not something that's based on the actual work you're doing in your lab. Yep. So I think that's part of it. And then the other, I think, little insight is, that people are attracted to other people, right? So if you don't have anything, people, technology, or money, if you can get a couple of really great people together, and in our case, we started with Bob Langer and Ben Shapiro. So a lot of people just wanted to be in the room with them. And so we were able to bring in some leading scientists and so on. And then you can build off of that. Mm-hmm. So, even if they don't necessarily want to be, there at the beginning, if they know that other people that they trust will be there, that can help to overcome that.
Yeah. So how many people do you have internally?
So we have about 65 people internally. About half of that team is science oriented. Mm-hmm. So scientists in the labs. I think a lot of people don't realize also that we have labs that we're sort of advancing new technologies. We have three different drug discovery platforms focused on the lymphatic system. So we have 66 people internally. And then the founded entities, those entities that are now advancing different ideas that were initially initiated by PureTech, have hundreds of employees.
Yep. Yep. So just for kind of the edification of our audience, so PureTech has assets and programs that it develops internally, but it also has been kind of the founding engine behind creating, several new companies as well. So when you talk about internal product candidates, those are the ones that you've developed internally. When you talk about founded entities, these are kind of the external companies that you've had a driving hand in investing in.
Yeah, so I think that's actually an interesting point. And what led us to this founded entity model was that initially we started PureTech with very little cash resources. So what we did was we partnered with venture capital funds to fund the development of these programs. And the way to do that is to have them, to put those programs into subsidiaries and have them be able to buy equity in those, subsidiaries. So these started off as internal, all of our programs basically started off as internal programs. And then, as part of this funding strategy, we created founded entities. Based on our ability to move those forward and our track record, we were able to raise significant capital on PureTech parent company level. And so now we're able to advance a group of these programs internally as wholly owned programs. And that's a relatively new development for us.
And, interesting, if you look at, reading through your annual report, you've managed to retain, even in the founded entities, you've managed to retain a very large share of equity in most of them. And I don't know if that has, progressed to higher and higher over the years, if you kind of needed less external capital to move them forward. But certainly it gives you the ability, now that you have more access to capital, that you can actually have more conviction behind the companies that you develop externally.
Yeah, so the ability to advance these founded entities, as we have been growing them, is is partly driven by the interest from outside investors, And what's happened is we start with 100% ownership initially, or close to it. We and the scientists own all of the equity because we are founders. So we're not getting equity for cash we put in. We're getting equity because we start this, and own 100%.
Right.
And because there's been a lot of investor interest in these entities, we've been able to retain a significant portion of that, even though we're not putting in a lot of the capital ourselves.
Yeah.
So actually in the last year, something close to 700 million came into these founded entities, and over 93% came from outside parties. We put in very small amount of that.
Yeah.
Do you see, Daphne, do you see the difference in what you're founding now and sort of building up within PureTech? Will you still do almost like the follow-on model? Will you morph those companies to spin out, or do you think you'll really grow them within PureTech long term?
Yeah, so the evolution of the model is that those fully owned programs, we plan to take them forward ourselves. And we feel that we have the resources, the capabilities to take them forward ourselves, and we don't need to bring in other funding sources. So that's the plan. And the slight, I think, difference between the founded entities, which are sort of focused broadly on the brain, the immune system, and the gut, and the brain immune gut axis, which is sort of the crosstalk between these systems, is that the internal pipeline is focused on sort of a more, a subset of that, which is the lymphatic system and related immunology. And so we believe that that enables us to learn from different platforms, even, one platform is going to succeed, another one's going to fail. We're going to learn based on the biology of this one area. But at the same time, I think it's still very broad because it goes across the brain, immune, and gut systems.
Do you feel that model gives you, say, you almost have a little bit of the best of both worlds, right? Because you not only get to do things internally, but when you have, the opportunity to give, someone like either Steve Paul or say Sai Mukherjee, the ability to kind of join that vision and create something like Karuna or Vor, it gives you that tool in the toolbox as well. You don't just have to say, well, no, sorry, we developed everything ourselves over here, which might dissuade folks like that from really being able to have kind of a larger or outsized voice within a single venture. There is still, I guess, the ability to lean into people that say, oh, we can be a part of this other big vision that we have here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that there's so much exciting science that one could pursue, and even coming out of our internal platforms, there's probably 5 NewCo ideas that one could spin out. But the idea is really, from a strategy perspective for PureTech, the default is it's internal, and we're going to be thinking about this internal pipeline as it progresses, as we even plan for potential commercialization at some point. We're going to be thinking about that first. And then there's going to be, obviously opportunities to spin out pieces of that, to partner with people like Steve Paul. And in the case of Sid Mukherjee, I mean, I think it was really exciting because, he was somebody we were talking to about a number of different ideas. And he's got many ideas of, science that could be advanced. So, absolutely, we want to be able to do both, but prioritize for us as a company the internal pipeline.
Okay. Do you feel, this is not quite a loaded question, but what are some of the advantages of being public in the way that you handle things here? There have been probably a couple of public vehicles that have tried to do company creation. I would argue that none has really done it as successfully as you guys have, but what are some of both the advantages and the challenges of needing to operate as a public company?
Yeah, so I think that the biggest advantage for us, we started PureTech with a $100,000 check from an angel investor. We built this up from completely the ground up. So the advantage for us, prior to our IPO in London, and we listed on the main market of the London Stock Exchange in 2015, were FTSE 250 index. One of the advantages for us was the year before IPO, we raised 100 million, and then we raised significant funding in our IPO on 200 million. And that enabled us to do a lot. Before that, we had raised collectively around 40 million. So,
wow.
the ability to access capital, I think, is the biggest advantage. I think for us, the issue has been is that there's not really many companies in the world like PureTech. So on the one hand, we have biotech specialists who have invested in, pretty much most of the founded entities and very good relationships with those leading biotech specialists. On the other hand, the parent company has mostly generalist investors who are, UK sort of generalists, very conservative. And so there's a major disconnect between, like events where you see driving a lot of value in a company like Karuna versus, our own shareholder base. I think that that's changing a little bit, though. I think that there's more interest in kind of new models. So you see that with BridgeBio, Royalty Pharma, a few other models like Schrodinger and so on that have sort of more than one specific platform or product idea. And so I think over time, we do think that there'll be sort of an investor base that consists of biotech specialists that understand the advantages of a non-binary approach to developing new medicines, where a management team is aligned to move the resources based on what's working, as opposed to sometimes I think having a bias to continue doing another experiment in an area that should just be shut down. So I think there's advantages to this model that investors are beginning to realize.
And when you,
I was just gonna say, I feel like there was a lot of discussion over maybe it was like 5 years ago and maybe to 10 about fail fast, right? I feel like that was a big thing. And now it's clearly you're implementing that, but in a biotech, non-pharma space, which I think is different. And we haven't seen that as much.
Yeah, and I think that you see it actually sometimes in like seed venture creation models. Like I know Atlas has that approach where they'll try to do kind of seeding and do early experiments and shut it down. And I think David Granger has also talked about doing that a lot. So I think you see it more on the biotech sort of pre-public side. Once you're a public biotech company, I think the incentives are aligned in a different way. And so this concept of a public biotech that has that, sort of approach of let's move our resources, let's fail fast, let's be really nimble about moving resources. I think that's not something that has been as much, let's say, at least in the US biotech.
Yeah, and if and where it does happen, it tends to happen behind closed doors, and you never really hear about it. You don't tend to hear about the companies that Atlas doesn't start, right? I think the only time there was really a good look at it, Bruce had a blog post a few years ago that actually talked about the 10 things that they started and the 2 things that they went forward and the 8 things that they killed, where either things just didn't work or whatever. But you very rarely get that look behind the curtain. So on that, one of the things that I wrote to you earlier that I think is interesting here. So you're, in a lot of ways, you look at quote unquote the next big thing, right? And if you look at some of the things on, within your portfolio, you were one of the first people that were deep into microbiome. Certainly one of the first people on the edge of digital therapeutics. I don't think this has hit quite mainstream yet, but you have, voice and health within your portfolio. And, rather than kind of go deep on any one of those things, I'm interested in talking about how long you take to marinate an idea and either what it takes to kill it or how long will you string it along? Because I think that's a process that we think it's interesting and it's fun to talk about where a certain field can go over a cup of coffee, but it's much, much different than talking about it for a while and saying, yes, we actually have to move into here, or no, we don't. So what's the time frame like for thinking about a place that you may want to go and then either getting the conviction to do it or actually putting it on the shelf and letting it go?
Yeah, I mean, so I think that there's obviously some changes between how we did things, when we were getting started versus how we do things now. So I think one thing that stayed the same is this concept of focusing on one theme or disease area. And in the case of the microbiome, we were really interested in sort of the crosstalk between the host immune system and these pathogens, and sort of came to and really took an approach of what's the where's where are the areas that you could actually build on the science. So there's a lot of correlation data, kind of a lot of buzz around the academic science around the microbiome, but where could you actually make a difference therapeutically? So that's sort of honed in. And we started there. Basically, it wasn't like a bunch of people who were interested in the microbiome. It was a bunch of leading immunologists.
Yeah.
In the case of digital therapeutics, we were really interested in cognition and attention, and how do you modulate that broadly in the population without, so more kind of remote approaches to doing that. And now that seems, really right on target. But at the time that we were doing it, it was, there was no digital therapeutics officers at any pharma companies.
Yeah, no.
People definitely smirking when we first started talking about the digital therapeutics approaches that we're taking. But one of the things that I think was also interesting there was a lot of times people were just like, why don't you just put this on the App Store? And we're like, no, we want to do a randomized controlled study where the control is a game that has expectation of benefit. And when Achilles was able to meet their primary endpoint, which is in that setting, I think it really helped validate the approach.
Yeah.
So I think that the concept, probably the way that we got to these new modalities, is by being modality agnostic and by focusing on the disease and thinking about, in the case of obesity, the way we got to mechanotherapeutics, so the approach that Gelesis is taking with Plenity, is by looking at, talking to leading obesity experts and then, really focusing on surgical approaches, saying, how could we sort of mimic this in an orally administered fashion, and then looking for technologies to do that. So I think it's by starting with the disease, by working with the experts, and then by being willing to look at a really novel concept, but also being really skeptical about it. So this combination of creativity, blue sky, but these pharma guys on our board, tend to be very, very tough and skeptical, and that, I think, being open to that skepticism, I think maybe this is just an interesting concept to throw out there. I believe that the benefit of those two perspectives coming together is critical. And people tend, I think the creative types don't like to get criticized, and the skeptical types don't like to have, people brush aside their concerns. But if you actually get the two together, you come up with something really special.
Yeah. You could almost recreate the conversation where the pharma guy says, now let me get this straight. You're going to use a video game, and you're going to do that instead of actually developing, developing a pill or an intervention that you're going to put through a clinical trial. And then someone says, well, why don't we just run a clinical trial with the video game? Why is it different?
Exactly. And actually, Ben Shapiro was he was at Merck, he was EVP of worldwide research there. And his talent is zoning in on, like, whatever you're talking about, what's the weakness? And I've really tried to learn from that, like, whatever, idea that you're focusing on, what's the weakness? What's the thing that's going to make it fall apart? And he was the one he was the most skeptical about Achilles, about Gelesis. And now he's basically the biggest supporter. He loves those concepts, and is really.
Well, data tends to do that, right?
Yes.
Data kind of helps. If you design things really well, you have the right interventions, you have the right people, and do a really rigorous clinical trial, people tend to believe that stuff, which is really nice. And, especially with digital therapeutics, you have this kind of merging of really the tech, the tech field in biotech. And, the FDA and regulation is anathema to anybody in the tech field, right? They don't want to go anywhere near it. And you get this perception that, well, this is how tech works. They work fast and break things, and that doesn't work in a clinical environment. But then when you actually port over some of those things, really a lot of this, and this has been a theme throughout all of the discussions that we've had, is we talk a lot about data, about patient outcomes, and about where everything is going. And if you think about the actual clinical outcomes that you're trying to affect, it doesn't really matter how you get there per se. And there's other examples. Verta Health is a really good one, where it's the intervention and the process that's therapeutic, not just kind of the single mode of intervention that you get with either an infusion or a pill. Interestingly, there's, one of the things that struck me is I'm wondering if you ever, how much pressure that you get to, be part of the new hot thing, right? There doesn't seem to be a rush to put together a gene therapy effort or a rush to dive deep into cell therapy just because that happens to be the hot area of the moment. And I don't know if I missed something buried deeper in the pipeline if you have all of those things anyway, but it doesn't seem like you have the things that happen to be the flavor du jour for the rest of the industry that a lot of money is chasing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've always been sort of, actually, it's probably partly because we, in the early phases, if something was being shopped around to a bunch of VCs when, we didn't really have any money, it wasn't something that we could actively pursue.
Yeah.
So it was almost like by necessity, we went to this, but it's really become an ingrained part of the model. And the idea is that we're not looking in areas that are being shopped by other people. We're really starting with these experts, and we're learning about ideas, new scientific breakthroughs before they're published through these conversations, and then building on those conversations, actually file patents ourselves together with those scientists and so on. And I think that across our pipeline of founded entities and internal, you'll see that every one of those programs we identified with knowledge that the rest of the world didn't have. So
yep.
That's, I think, a key piece of it, is knowing something that's not out there yet, and then being able to act on it quickly and, address whatever is missing. So I think a lot of what's interesting is that when we're doing our sourcing and sort of thematic, looking at new ideas, we'll sometimes run into big pharma companies, and they take sort of this disease approach, and they're talking to all the experts. The difference is that the big pharma company will say to the scientist, all right, come back to me when you've shown that you've done the following 3 experiments.
Right.
And we say, we think you need to do the following 3 experiments, and now we're going to take this in and we're going to do those experiments ourselves. Mm-hmm. So the pharma companies identify these approaches, but sometimes they just don't do anything with them. They wait.
Yeah.
Speaking of patents, because we do have a question from the audience about patents. And it plays into the fail fast sort of conversation we had earlier. The question is, given the willingness to walk away from prior patents, what do you have for your IP strategy? Trade secrets? Do you file inexpensive provisionals and then only file a few full patents? License in or out a lot other? Clearly, this guy is an IP expert.
Yeah. So yeah, we have 3 full-time patent folks on the team, 2 patent attorneys, actually 3, because my chief business officer and the president of PureTech is also a former patent attorney. So we have a very kind of let's say intense approach to IP. Mm-hmm. And the idea is really both to build on intellectual property that was developed at a particular institution, to file our own IP, to do experiments, and so on. I'd say trade secrets might be part of it, but it is really sort of a tradition, I'd say a more traditional IP approach. And we license it, we build on it and we file patents ourselves.
And how have you married because traditionally, therapeutics companies and digital technology companies use IP very differently, right? And so they like Derek said, there's the throwaway in the tech space, right? You do it, if it works, then someone else is in there. But clearly that's been a primary value driver on the therapeutic side, right? The IP. So how have you married that on your digital piece, your digital company?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, one thing that we did was we partnered there with Adam Ghazali at UCSF, and he had some initial IP. And, when we were negotiating with UCSF, we looked to see how strong that IP was. And one sign would be, could we do this without their IP, and we couldn't, so I think that is a sign that it's pretty, it's pretty strong. We bring in litigators early on, to sort of poke holes. And I think it is even in the digital space, it is very much a biopharma approach to IP. So I don't think we've innovated much in that area because we're just building on best practices of the industry.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, if you can get the assets you need from an IP standpoint, it's interesting. And in a lot of ways, people look to when you're looking at kind of a single mode venture around university IP, usually it's maximizing the value of that IP. You've almost flipped it to say, well, we need this IP to do the things that we want to do. You don't necessarily have to have that IP be the be all end all of your idea. You just have to, put the pieces around your idea to protect it.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So interestingly enough, in looking at this, I saw a couple of things that, I saw Gelesis or Gelesis, excuse me, is partnering with a telehealth company to basically start to build its commercial force. How do you see kind of the commercial and the kind of last mile, so to speak, of patient engagement and really reaching the audience changing? Because when you think about a commercial stage pharma or biotech company, virtually all of them have pinned their commercial strategies around the way that you were supposed to go out and reach an audience, reach your customers, reach your patients, right? So being now on the cusp of commercialization in a few areas, you have the ability to do that differently. And do you think pretty differently about how you'd like to try and do that?
Yeah, so I think one of the advantages of the founded entity model in those cases is they've got some of the best people really thinking about the commercial strategies around those specific products and just completely focused on everything from the user experience to the patient engagement and so on. In the case of Gelesis and Plenity, they plan to launch also with traditional healthcare providers and feel like that's really important. But in the case of weight management, often people don't feel comfortable talking to their, primary care physician, calling them up and saying, I want to lose a few pounds. And so in the case of Roe, which is a really interesting company, they have, they have this infrastructure that they've built around products that people would prefer to not, call their primary care physicians on. I mean, it's not everything they're doing, but that was sort of how they started building it. And it might be a convenience thing or it might be an embarrassment thing. So what you can do is you on the Row platform right now, and you can, click on Plenity, and there'll be a provider there who is, going to ask you all the questions. There's a whole, there's a lot of thought that went into that with key opinion leaders in the obesity space to make sure, for example, there's definitely privacy concerns and things like that they've addressed. But, for example, they have to make sure that somebody really qualifies. So the range of BMI is pretty broad. For Plenty, it's 25 to 40 BMI. But you still have to make sure that, somebody qualifies. So the idea is you call up, you can speak to a provider, and then if you qualify, you can get it shipped to your house within 2 days. Oh, wow. So I think is, kind of an innovative approach. And it is, as far as we know, the first primary care product to launch also with a telehealth arm. And I think we can learn a lot from biopharma. The biopharma industry can learn a lot from the tech side of things in terms of user engagement. For example, think how connected we are to our, tech products, whether it be Zoom or our iPhone. You don't think of any pharmaceutical product that you're connected to in that way. So I think that's an area where biotech can learn a lot from the tech world.
Yeah, I would agree. And we've had this discussion a couple of different times now where, I think everyone sees that model in some ways as needing to shift one way or the other. And I think most pharma companies are, I think most companies are pretty aware of this, right? I think they're aware of the way that they've traditionally been strong and how they sell their products. But I think they're also aware of the fact that I think patients are getting smarter about what they're doing. And I think patients want to be more engaged with their health outcomes. And we've seen this through electronic devices and through, how people are thinking about their health data. But I think pharma is waking up to that. It's also, it's also kind of hard to change. a big pharma institution, and it's, you know, slightly easier when you're starting from nothing to say, how should we actually be interacting with patients? And now, you know, now we have a nice COVID segue, right? Because now we're thinking a lot more about how to reach people with telehealth and how to actually do things in a different way when certain avenues are taken away from you. So in the future, you know, it's not clear how many things will be outside the hospital and how many things will be inside the hospital, but it seems that that line may not be black and white anymore, maybe a very large gray area in the middle of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we're all seeing kind of firsthand that there's a lot of stuff that we could probably do remotely. Not everything, but there's, you know, there's some advantages to being forced to do that, and that you learn what you can do. You know, you mentioned Sound Health earlier, and I think that's interesting because they're developing vocal biomarkers to be able to screen and diagnose a range of health conditions. The idea being that based on 5 seconds of voice, you can identify a range of changes. So for example, when you speak, you use 100 muscles, your respiratory system, your cardiovascular system, of course, your brain, and any small disruptions in any of those systems and the muscles actually can be picked up in your voice. So the idea is it's like the 21st century version of a thermometer, but much, you know, much broader. And that's what Sound Health is doing. I think that is very relevant for sort of the new emerging landscape for healthcare.
Yeah, we're all actually now at least pretty comfortable with, you know, putting a microphone and a speaker in our house, right? I mean, the success of Alexa actually helps there. I think there's probably a little bit of fear in terms of, you know, having that type of data be listened and analyzed. But, you know, when you think about things, if we shift from a reactionary to a predictive medical society, right? If we're actually looking at catching diseases earlier, I think that the term J&J uses is disease interception, right? If we're looking at that, we have to think about the ways that we have to collect new data that's actually going to tell us something interesting. And voice is certainly one of those areas where, you know, it's a passive collection. You don't have to send a sample to anyone. You can collect, you know, the amount of data that you want, and you now have something that can actually be genuinely predictive of, you know, driving physiology or any sorts of changes. And you only need to think about paradigms like either caring for aging relatives or anything like it, where a passive data collection is really, really helpful.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that, you know, in the case of Sound, similar to Achille, they're doing everything, you know, in a HIPAA compliant way. People have to opt in. So there's a lot of thought that went into a biopharma-like perspective, even though the technology could have been kind of just rolled out broadly and used you know, as an additional tech product.
Yeah, well, I think, go ahead, Jennifer.
I do think as people get more comfortable with using a digital interface with healthcare providers, you know, the older model was you developed the drug, it was approved. If it wasn't picked up as much in primary care, but it had a high safety profile, you tried to push it OTC. And so this way it allows you to interact more directly with patients, marrying them like you're doing with the physician digitally. And I think COVID will accelerate patients' willingness to be able to interact that way. I think it's, you know, it was an unfortunate but positive byproduct of what we're dealing with right now.
Absolutely. That's a really good point.
We actually had, we've got a couple of questions that I wanted to make sure we got to before the end of our time. So there was one question, you know, earlier we had talked about, you know, sort of the failing fast. There's a question that says, if you talk to most people who've developed successful drugs over time, they always have a story about when their program was almost shut down. And so are you ever worried that this ability to do the experiments quickly that are the hardest ones and causing it to fail fast will, as they say, throw some babies out with the bathwater?
Oh, that's such a good point. I mean, I think that it is a balance, because we've had some programs that were almost killed a few times, and you have to then believe in it enough to do another experiment, to make sure also, like, for example, one thing we do is we repeat the academic work. in our own hands. And we've had many times where if we take it and just try to repeat it ourselves, we can't do it. So a collaboration with the scientists, bringing one of the postdocs actually on site and making sure that we haven't missed anything. And sometimes trying a few times before you actually decide that you couldn't repeat it. So there is that sort of balance between being really unbiased and also being kind of persistent in the way that a typical entrepreneur is. But I think that that benefits from looking across a lot of different approaches, because you say, okay, well, every time we're about to do something, we look at any way we could spend our resources, our time, and our money. And the thing that we're looking at has to sort of hold up against the others. And that forces you to just be, very diligent about it. But I think that's a wonderful point. And you do have to sometimes hold on to something, and otherwise you'd never, succeed in that particular approach, especially ones that are a little bit outside the box.
Yep. So the counter to that too is where you see something that you think is really, really good, but strategically it just kind of doesn't fit, right? It's one of the challenges of actually, picking a strategy and sticking to it, where you look at it and you say, this has all the hallmarks of being awesome, and in a different time we would have been all over it, but it doesn't fit within what we do. We don't, it doesn't fit within where our team is, but we kind of know it's great, type of thing. So are there any of those that you either wish had fit into your strategy, or not so much that you regret losing, but almost you regret the opportunity to go after them because you thought you would be really interesting?
Yeah, I think that it's hard to know, because it's like this, somebody else took it forward and they succeeded with it. And
yeah,
there's this tendency to assume that you would have been as successful with it. And sometimes, that if that technology or that approach found the right home and it's going to help patients, I don't think we should regret that at all. I can't think of one specific, situation, but I do think that we very many times have to say we're not going to do something, even if it's great science.
yeah.
And sometimes a great collaborator that we really want to work with, and that's happened actually multiple times.
It is much easier to look at the outcome of something and remember that you had a good idea and say, yeah, I was right. That's the way it would have worked. I totally would have nailed it.
Exactly.
It does, it's not a lot of investment, but the reinforcement bias does actually make you feel a little bit better. Like, yeah, I think I was onto something with that idea. I'm glad it worked.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when Uber was getting started, I was like, I wish I could just call a cab and, do it on my iPhone, and, but to assume that, you know what I mean? I think it's just human nature.
Well, it's funny, right? Because I remember vividly, Uber wasn't very old, and you usually would get into this impeccably clean car, and it was a good experience. And I remember staying in Cambridge and getting in a cab in the morning it was a minivan cab with, let's just say it was less than appetizing in terms of like what the actual interior was. And, I had a meta conversation with the driver who was railing on Uber. Oh, how would you do that? You have no idea who's going to pick you up or what kind of car you're going to get into. And I said, yeah, you never really know, do you? It's never really clear, is it? I don't think the irony got through to them, but yeah, it's you see those experiences and you're like, yeah, these people were definitely onto something. All right, so we've got probably about 10 minutes left here, and to shift a little bit. So do you think that, kind of COVID has, changed the way that the industry thinks a little bit in terms of not so much how it portrays itself, but how it thinks about things, from a broader social perspective? So there are companies that have really turned on a dime and kind of gone after vaccine programs or gone after antibody programs really, really quickly because, medically it was the right thing to do. And, the biopharma industry, sadly has this perception where it's not as I don't want to say respected, but it's not quite as loved for what we tend to do as perhaps it should be. But, you see, in a lot of the ways that in a lot of the leaders within the industry and a lot of the citizens, most of the conversation that I saw via Twitter and social media was around data, around best practices, around, how we're changing things with COVID. So do you see a little bit of a shift at all about how leaders within biopharma are a little more open and outward with, kind of our connection to the rest of the world and what we should be doing as an industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a few things that have happened, which I like a lot, are the sharing of scientific research, sort of honing this post-publication peer review. I think that's actually been really helpful. The power of social media platforms like Twitter to tear apart a new piece of research, whether it's peer reviewed or not, and actually
Yep.
put holes in it. I think all of that has been really great. In terms of the biopharma industry, I really don't, I think that I understand to some extent when people go and they have to pay a lot for a medicine, or they get overcharged by a hospital for some, procedure, that we get a backlash as an industry for that. But I mean, I think it's strange to see how biopharma is often kind of lumped in with these, like, tobacco or other industries that are causing harm, where, it's fundamentally an industry built of people that are trying to solve problems, that are trying to make a difference in disease, and often based on, family or other connections to those diseases. So I never really, I felt like that was always just a little bit of a bad rap. And I'm not really sure, what drives it, but I think it has to do with billing and, practices around insurance and
Yep.
less about biopharma. In terms of COVID, I think it's great to see companies move quickly. I am a little bit concerned about some of the, buzz or hype and, retail investors coming in and,
Yeah.
not fully understanding what it means to have a certain level of data. So I'm a little bit concerned about a backlash afterwards,
Hmm.
but I do think that, it's all come from good intentions.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we're in an area now where, you can only imagine the, fast forward a few months, if antibody testing is widespread, and if, some of the 100 antibody tests that we have aren't really up to snuff, you can then get, public distrust of the data if the tests themselves aren't any good. And, that really diminishes the folks that actually, worked hard to get, quote unquote, the best tests that they could, and get the best data that they could. But honestly, I think there's a difficulty in I think the public understanding things on a very granular level. So the broad picture that they get is more tests are better because people are developing tests. And on a granular level, I think this is probably one of the challenges of communicating science, where it's not quite that simple, right? You have folks like Derek Lowe who can deconstruct, clinical data and who can actually dig into the numbers. And that's, helpful and amazing in a lot of ways, but for the vast majority of people, it goes past the headlines, so they don't necessarily get to go that deep. And that might be one of the challenges that, biotech has in really, cementing itself in terms of the public opinion, because the data is always more complicated, right? Picking out what is a good drug and what isn't a good drug is hard when, it works amazingly for a fraction of patients, and it doesn't work for some other ones. So I remember vividly a few years ago, it was around the holidays, and a commercial came on TV, and my father said, oh, look at the list of side effects on this drug, and the drug was Opdivo. And I said, Dad, it might have some side effects, but quite honestly, this drug has basically revolutionized stage 4 metastatic melanoma, right? So I think when people are used to looking at what drugs are on TV, they hear the side effects, but they don't necessarily know some of the good things or many of the good things that they can do.
We have a couple of more questions, and I know we only have a few minutes. This is sort of like our race to the end of our conversation. This question actually harkens back to the beginning and sort of how you've set up PureTech. The question is, how often do you start with a gee whiz and we find a place for this technology, i.e., this is so great we can't let it go. We'll shoehorn it in somewhere. And then how often are you talking about an interesting problem and then you go out and solicit solutions, right, as you look at ideas? What's the balance?
It's like 99% the latter. We always start with the idea and just, sorry, the need, and then the idea that might solve that need, and then look for different solutions. Sometimes those are coming from academics, sometimes those are inventions from our team, but it's always that latter. You know, we're starting with a disease or a problem as opposed to a specific technology. As you know, Joe Bolin, our CSO, likes to say, I mean, he was at a number of different pharma companies before, said when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we definitely are the opposite of that. We're very much modality agnostic.
Yeah, we have one more about, you know, diversity and inclusion. You know, after with, you know, the killing of George Floyd, and now we have you know, protests everywhere. You know, the question comes up about diversity and inclusion in biotech. Although, you know, I would go back even further, and I would think back to JP Morgan a couple of years ago with, you know, the inappropriate parties, et cetera. And we, you know, a few years ago we were talking about sexism in biotech, but, you know, more broadly we're talking about, you know, inclusion of, you know, minorities and non-older gray-haired white males in the industry, and you've actually been a driving force, I think, for, you know, inclusion in a lot of different ways. So, you know, I would ask how you think about that, both personally and as the way as the leader of a company, right? As the kind of team that you'd like to assemble, and the kind of, you know, image and community that you like to project within your organization.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the issues we have as an industry is it's an industry that's driven by pattern recognition. So, you know, people like to bet on the types of people and the types of ideas and the types of company concepts that have been successful before, and they like to avoid the ones that haven't. And so if you don't have examples of success, it's really hard to build that kind of pattern recognition for groups that have not been typically sort of CEOs of biotech companies, whether they be, you know, the gender stereotypes or, you know, other racial sort of stereotypes or leadership, you know. So the thing I think we need to do is be aware that we all have unconscious bias, and we, even if we are very much aware of it and are focusing on it, we have to be especially open to the idea that people who might have a different background or, you know, just be different than the rest of the team, and that could be in any way, that they might have had different challenges, and to really make sure that we understand what, you know, how we can help them to be successful in our organization. And so I think that for us, it's really a matter of making sure anybody who we're working with has every opportunity to be successful. And I think one thing I'm really proud of is that people have joined PureTech straight out of their postdocs, and then they're leading efforts, running companies, you know, driving forward new medicines, and it's all merit-based. But even having a merit-based system, you have to make sure that you're enabling somebody's, you know, full skill sets to be applied.
Yeah.
Does that
Well,
answer?
that's fantastic. Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's, you know, I don't think any of those questions has a perfect answer, but really, I mean, you can't do better than, you know, kind of recognizing bias and doing things to correct it, right? And, you know, by, you know, basically leading by example and finding ways to empower people and finding ways to bring them into your community, I think is laudable in a lot of ways. And quite honestly, from everything else that I've seen across different industries, whenever people look at the numbers, diversity is a strength. Right? When you find diverse backgrounds that come together, that always ends up being a strength. That always ends up being an advantage. So, you know, I think there's a lot to that, and I think it's commendable in a lot of ways.
And when we're developing therapeutics and treatments for the entire world, we want the voices of those people that we hope to treat and cure. And so it's really important that we work hard to include those voices in the development process as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of companies like PureTech are doing a really good job at that. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think we could even do better. I mean, and we're very focused on trying to, you know, continue to improve on that front as well.
Well, we are.
1 minute.
We're right at the end. So at this point, you know, thank you so much. I look back at my notes, and every one of these things we leave topics on the table, which to me means that you're an incredible guest, and we've covered a lot of things. So thank you so much. I appreciate you coming on, and thanks from the audience. And we're just incredibly impressed with what you've been able to build, and just wanted to thank you for sharing your morning with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. This was really fun. Thanks for setting it up. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.